Welcome everyone to Railway Industry Association's Transport Decarbonisation Week webinar. My name is Milda Manamoitite. I'm the Innovation Director at RIA, and it's great to have you here. We have excellent three speakers discussing transport and railway decarbonisation with you. And to set the scene and kick off the conversations, I would like to introduce David Clarke, RIA's Technical Director, who will be sharing our views on how to decarbonize railway. David, over to you.
Thank you, Milda. Good morning, everybody. As Milda said, my name's David Clarke. I'm the Technical Director here at RIA. I've worked in the industry for over 35 years now, and I first came across decarbonisation on the East Coast Mainline electrification programme. Although it wasn't called decarbonisation then, it was simply called electrification, because at the time the reason for doing that investment was because it's a better way to run an intensively used railway. It's only in recent years that we've realised its additional value in terms of decarbonisation. So I just want to share some thinking just to set the scene and hopefully give you some food for thought in terms of the questions you might want to ask, because the main part of this event is all about the panel discussion, and we really want a lot of input from the audience. So this is very much a scene setter. So what is rail's role in transport decarbonisation? Because this week is about decarbonising the whole of transport. Well, why are we doing it? I hope nobody on this call needs convincing that there is a climate emergency. There have been deniers, climate deniers. There continues to be climate deniers, but I hope everybody recognises, and these headlines illustrate, that we really can't ignore what the inexorable rise in temperature, and we've got to do something about this if we're going to be able to keep within the 1.5 degree range that's considered to be where we need to get to. And in order to do that, we need to decarbonise the whole economy, including transport. And transport as a proportion of carbon is actually growing, and that's clearly not a situation that is sustainable. Well, the good news is there's a plan. The government back in June 21 published a thing called the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, and I've drawn out here the rail elements of that because we're talking about rail in this particular webinar. And I've highlighted a number of them because these are effectively the things that RIA and many others in the industry were calling for before the publication of this plan. So to deliver a net zero rail network by 2050, and the government have an ambition to remove all diesel-only trains, both passenger and freight, by 2040. Let's put that into perspective. That is not very far away. We're in 2023 today. Deliver an ambitious and sustainable and cost-effective programme of electrification, guided by Network Rail's TDNS. That stands for Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, which was a piece of work that one of our other speakers, Helen McAllister, was involved in. And develop and deploy battery and hydrogen technology. Many of the other 8 points here are important too. For example, modernising fares and ticketing and retail to encourage a shift to rail, improving connectivity with walking, cycling and other modes of transport, and introducing a rail freight growth target. So those, on the face of it, that's really good, isn't it? That there's a plan in place. It was put in place in June 21. And you'll notice the little red piece at the bottom. Scotland are even more ambitious for their rail network than the rest of the UK, and they're aiming for net zero rail by 2035, which is 12 years away. So there's quite a lot to be done. So isn't it good news that there's a plan? Well, let's see how what's been happening since June 21 and that being published. But first of all, let's just consider what rail can do. Excuse me. Rail also supports the wider transport decarbonisation through the opportunity of modal shift. Rail is accountable for about 1.4% of UK transport emissions, but we actually carry up to 10% of daily passengers. So actually we punch above our weight as a transport mode, which is good, and I think you can understand that, because what rail is particularly good at is high density public transport into major cities or over long distances, and of course freight. And completion of projects like Crossrail and HS2 open up new capacity, which give us the opportunity to get more people onto public transport. The map on the right-hand side is a map published in the last week or so by the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, highlighting the importance of rail freight. And every rail freight train takes the equivalent of 76 lorries off the road. And the CILT's report highlights that as little as 60 miles of infill electrification would transfer a significant amount of road transport onto rail. And they've also identified how as little as 800 miles could decarbonise 95% of freight. So there's a plan. It can significantly impact and benefit wider transport decarbonisation. So how much work is there to do? What's the size of the challenge? Well, actually, we start off in a reasonably good place. Already 70% of the passenger fleet is electric. And you can see here in the pie chart, if we're thinking about passenger fleets, then we've got to deal with these ones on the right-hand side. And they group into 4 distinct categories. You probably recognize these types of trains. Top left, there's the relatively new bi-modes, about 1,000 of those. Bottom left, there's the 125 mile an hour intercity trains like the Voyager. And on the right-hand side, there's the medium distance 75 and 100 mile an hour diesel multiple units. You'll recognize those, I'm sure, so you probably traveled on them. They need to be decarbonised by 2050, as do the approximately 850 freight locomotives. So what are we calling for as an industry to help do that? Well, first of all, we're calling for more electrification for intensively used lines. I think you'll hear more from Noel about this. Why electrification? Well, first of all, rail has the benefits when thinking about decarbonisation that it has proven technology. Electrification's certainly proven. We've got 38% of our network is already electrified. That's substantially less than many developed countries, and in Europe it's typically 60+% electrified. Why would you do electrification? Well, as I've already mentioned, back in the 80s and 90s when we were electrifying East Coast, you were doing it because it costs less in the long term to run your railway. It improves journey times because it better braking and acceleration. It reduces passenger delays. It's quieter, it's lighter. And last and by no means least, but this wasn't frankly so important in the 80s and 90s, it's lower carbon. So it remains the best whole life option for an intensively used railway, but we're not going to be, nor should we want to electrify the whole of the network. So we need to have a few other solutions. And hydrogen is one of those. It's already operating in several European countries, but there's a challenge with hydrogen and indeed with batteries. There's a weight challenge and there's a volume challenge. And just as electric cars have, there's a range anxiety and there's a refueling challenge. But this is an increasingly realistic option for passenger trains up to 100 miles an hour, especially trains that are off the wires for more than about 100 miles an hour, 100 miles. And already we're seeing the first vehicles being built, albeit at risk, because as I'll mention later, there are as yet no fleet orders. Batteries have got a key role. Up to trains are being developed with ranges of up to about 70 miles. We're seeing fast charging capability being developed, and there's a parallel here again with the automotive industry. There's opportunities here for batteries to take you across relatively short gaps in the wires. That could mean a branch line at the end of a service, or it could mean a gap in the wires to avoid an area of difficult electrification. So there's a number of different ways that you can use this technology. There are other carbon reduction options out there. Again, like automotive, we're looking at hybrids. We're looking at alternative and synthetic fuels, as is aviation. We're looking at dual fuel. Also, there's mechanical storage has been tried. Many of those are options that you might want to consider in combinations with others, and a number of them are low rather than zero carbon, but could be really useful interim solutions, because if we're trying to save carbon, in my argument always is if we start now and we save a ton of carbon in 2023, we've saved 27 tons by the time you get to 2050. If you wait till 2049, you've only saved a ton. So that's why we're calling for rapid action. A key challenge is freight. The energy needs of freight require additional electrification to get to net zero. When you're trying to haul the equivalent of 76 HGVs, you need a lot of power. And battery and hydrogen aren't plausible for freight over any sort of long distance. So there's some great initiatives already going on in the freight industry. We see a number of users of hydrogenated vegetable oil to power freight trains. A challenge there is that's more expensive than diesel. And so what's the commercial incentive for operators to do the right thing? We see multi-mode locomotives being brought in, which have low carbon credentials. We see longer trains. So if you're going to haul a train, let's haul the longest one you possibly can. Again, good for carbon. And we're seeing moves towards express freight to sort of take to deal with the parcels industry and smaller high value freight. So some really good initiatives out there. So all credit to the freight industry. However, as I hinted at before, there's a gap between policy and delivery. On the left-hand side are those three objectives of the June 21 decarbonising transport plan, and they're the three that I highlighted. And on the right-hand side is a report from the House of Commons Transport Committee from only a couple of weeks ago, basically marking the homework from the decarbonisation plan and highlighting that the government needs to increase the current pace of electrification set out in the TDNS if it's to get all diesel-powered trains off the track by 2040. And there needs to be a long-term strategy, and there needs to be some clarity about the future use of which bits of the network will use electrification, battery and hydrogen, and that they should be supported by a credible delivery plan. So sadly, we've effectively lost a couple of years because, as the House of Commons Transport Select Committee have identified, the things on the left haven't yet been put in place. And we would say that we need to start now. The blue block on the right hand, well, maybe I'll explain the left-hand side of the graph first. So the red bars are the amount of electrification delivered in the UK over the past 50 or so years. And as you can see, that's quite peaky. And that, in my opinion, and as set out in the RIA Electrification Cost Challenge, goes a long way to explaining why the cost of electrification in the UK has been high, because simply we haven't had the consistent volume to drive efficient delivery and to retain skills and capability in our workforce. The blue block on the right-hand side is what we would need to do per annum in order to deliver the 13,000 kilometres that was proposed by the TDNS in 2020. So the good news is, as you can see, that's not an inconceivable amount of electrification, because if you look at the red bars, twice in the past we've delivered that volume, and in the 80s we actually managed to deliver it fairly efficiently. We didn't deliver it so efficiently in the more recent program in the 2010s, but that's a whole other story. But it has, however, made the government reluctant to support electrification because of the cost overruns that they experienced, notably on Great Western. So there's a huge volume. You'll notice, however, that there's a gap between 2019 and about 2025, because frankly, there's nothing happening at the moment. Now, even if we look at all the projects we know about that are in the offing, which is this little green blob. So we know Transpennine Middle and Main Line are underway, as is Cardiff Valley. The Scots are planning an ambitious decarbonisation programme. We know all about those, and they're very welcome. At the best, they're only just getting started, well, with the noble exception of Cardiff Valley's is probably the furthest ahead. They're not all funded yet, and as the comparison between the green block and the blue block illustrates, they're not enough to achieve net zero carbon. So frankly, we are way behind the trajectory we need to be on. And also, by the way, there's no hydrogen or battery trains being ordered in any significant way. Therefore, RIA this week are launching a campaign called Rail Decarb 23, and we're urging the government to look at 3 key steps to hit net zero by 2050, taking some inspiration, I suppose, from the Transport Select Committee and our previous asks. We had very similar asks a number of years ago before the 2020 plan was published. We want to see a rolling programme of cost-effective electrification, and we believe it can be cost-effective on intensively used lines. And we want to see fleet orders of low-carbon rolling stock. We also, and this is a new ask, we want to make sure that there's a proper conversation going on about how we develop and implement lower carbon solutions. I gave the example of hydrogenated vegetable oil. There's a solution there which would reduce carbon, but there's no commercial incentive to introduce it. So how do we close that circle and do the right thing so that we can reduce carbon as quickly as we can and hit net zero by 2050? Because in the rail industry, we've demonstrated a plan to hit 2050, but every year that we don't start that plan threatens our ability to deliver. So thank you very much. If I can hand back to Milda, I'll stop sharing the slides now.
Amazing. Thank you very much, David. I don't see any questions piling in, so while I see the hands raised up, we will take questions after all of the panelists have presented their views. So if you do have a question, type that in the Q&A, and I'll come back when we have that time and call you out, and you'll have an opportunity to ask it live. Unless there's something burning, Gavin, can you wait until the Q&A? If you can, please lower your hand. If not, okay, amazing. Thank you. And I have prepared a nice poll for you to get to know you before we get into a Q&A. Right. And without any further ado, I would like to go to our panel, and the panelists will introduce themselves, and I will start with Helen.
Hi, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you all about a subject that's very close to my heart. Some of you probably know me already and have seen me banging on about this topic in previous webinars, conferences, etc. In case you don't, I'm Helen McAllister. Until recently, I was the Network Strategy and Planning Director at Network Rail, and also the Programme Director for Freight Reform at Great British Railways Transition Team. So I know a bit about freight and I know a bit about rail decarbonisation. I was the lead of the team that produced the traction decarbonisation network strategy, and that is one of the inputs into the long-term strategy for rail that GBRTT are beavering away on right now. So I think that's probably enough about my credentials. Why am I passionate? I don't have any slides, sorry. But why am I passionate about this? There's many reasons, but kind of an example of it is I took my kids to school this morning and it's snowing in South London. It doesn't happen very often. And my daughter asked me, is it snowing because of global warming? And she's 10. And I said, no, it's not snowing because of global warming. It's March, it's the UK, it snows. What I didn't then go on to say was all the other climate effects that we have been seeing over the past couple of years and that we are seeing that are due to global warming and climate change, because it's only a 2-minute walk to the school and she's only 10. And I'd quite like her to sleep at night. But I think there is a real clear imperative for governments around the world, not just in the UK, to try and get a grip on the fact that there needs to be action towards addressing climate change, towards trying to keep global temperatures down, and that needs action in all areas, not just the big areas, not just the big hitting sexy headline areas. So for rail, a lot of the time the question that gets asked is why are you worrying about this? Why are you worrying about decarbonising something that's less than 2% of the UK's carbon emissions? Well, because we need to worry about all of it. We can't just worry about, yes, today we'll worry about HGVs, and then in 10 years' time, we will be worrying about the railway, and it will be too late to put something in place that is meaningful, that helps. I am also a big fan of doing things that can be done. And decarbonising traction power on the railway is most definitely in the category of something that can be done. And in fact, helping to decarbonise surface transport is something that the railway can do. So not just by being more carbon neutral itself, but by also kind of abstracting largely freight from the roads until there is a kind of widespread electrification of the roads. So that's why I think we should be talking about it, and why I think it's important, and why I think it's important to start now. What needs to be done, I think there is a general consensus on that if you want to decarbonise traction power on the railway across both passenger and freight, then you need a reasonably chunky amount of electrification, and you need some other technologies around the edges, and you need hydrogen, and you need to use biofuels, and you need to use batteries more. And I believe that we need to use the technologies that we have, and they will improve, and that's great. But what we can't rely on is something magical to appear in 2040 that then fixes all our problems by 2050. And sometimes that's how it can feel, that as a country, that's our strategy at the moment, that somebody will come up with something in the, just before the countdown hits zero. But sadly, large infrastructure doesn't really work like that. And it's not something that we can rely on. So let's use what we've got now, take the plans that are in place, and be really clear about what can be done and why it needs to be done. Some of that is about demonstrating that this isn't necessarily about the railway, it's about more than the railway. We don't want to decarbonise the railway just because we like railways, but we want to decarbonise the railway because it adds value in a huge amount of other areas, in stimulating the economy, in improving air quality, in being part of an overall UK strategy to get to net zero. And then Also, that there are other benefits apart from decarbonisation that will become big and headline hitting in the future, like air quality, for example, and particulate matter. We will still need railways even when the roads are zero carbon because of that. And there are just so many reasons. David highlighted the gap between policy and activity at the moment. And I think that's a really key thing to address. It is very difficult now to see a route by which all the electrification that could be done or that needs to be done could be done by 2050. And therefore, I think there is an urgent need to understand what the pathway is and where do we actually expect to get to by 2050, so that as an industry, we can plan and respond to that, and the supply chain can plan and respond to that and deliver what needs to be delivered in an economic and efficient fashion. I'm going to pause there and hope that's okay, but I very much look forward to the debate afterwards and the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, Helen. Some interesting sound bites you've said there, and I've written them down. And I see some questions are coming in.
So have I, yeah.
Yeah, you should be quoted. It's a very quotable speech. So now I'm going to Noel, and then we'll go to the panel discussion.
Yeah, hi, morning everyone. I'm Noel Dolphin, and I work for Fro and Frey, but have a much wider interest than a company interest in decarbonisation and electrification. I do have a short presentation. I wasn't asked, but I've done one anyway. And David and Milda have kindly indulged me, so I will hopefully share some slides now.
Amazing.
Cool. So yeah, two apologies. One, for those who find the format too bright for a midweek morning, this was subject to a public vote on Twitter, and yeah, they voted for this format, so sorry. Secondly, I think I'll repeat a few things that both Helen and David has said, particularly in David's slides as well. I'm really focusing on the benefits of electric railways and electrification. There are definitely other technologies in decarbonisation, so yeah, hydrogen and batteries. And I work on battery projects, so I'm definitely not anti-battery or hydrogen, and they do have their place. However, rail is a system, and a lot of the benefits of that system are interoperability. So for a substantial part of the railway, I think electrification is going to be key to decarbonise. But beyond just decarbonisation, the railway has great benefits for our economy and our society, and an electric railway helps support those. It helps make a better railway, hence the title here. RIA, as part of its Decarbonisation 23 programme, and myself and David Shires from Rail Engineer magazine, who's on the webinar now, and Paul Hooper and Gary Keenor from Atkins are currently working on a benefits paper that will be published shortly as part of Decarb 23. And so this is kind of a synopsis of that paper that will come out in the next few weeks. So I've only got 2 slides, so it will be relatively short. Here's the first one. So yeah, rail electrification costs often a hot topic. With decarbonisation, yeah, we want a rolling programme, but the government and Treasury often don't want to finance it, and we often think of the cost of electrification in terms of capital costs. How much does it cost to put steel in the ground, essentially? But I want to turn that discussion on its head. Rather than capital costs, what are the savings from operating an electric railway? And if we can generate more savings, well, actually, we can help build more electrification and decarbonise quicker. So here is a list of all those savings, or at least some of them. So yeah, just to very quickly go round, yeah, some of those savings. So one, electric trains are cheaper to purchase than any other form, certainly cheaper than diesel, and significantly cheaper cheaper than battery or hydrogen trains. They're also much more efficient than diesel or hydrogen, significantly so. So about 3 times more efficient than either of those. So your actual power to run the trains is substantially less. Electric trains are lighter, so there's less track maintenance needed, and the trains themselves need less maintenance. So maintaining the train costs less. They're also far more reliable. So on some routes, up to 300% more reliable. And not only does that reduce delay minutes, it also means operators buy less electric trains. So there is lower capital costs for buying trains that are cheaper in themselves, and you need less spares, etc. And also electric trains have much better acceleration, and this allows more trains on a route. And the more trains you have on a route, the more seats you can sell, or the more freight routes you can sell. So yeah, we have more room for passengers and more room for tickets and more room for revenue. And if you add up all these savings over the life of a vehicle, so around 30 years, the savings about 2 to 3 million, even when you include the cost of electrifying the railway and building all that infrastructure. And 2 to 3 million doesn't sound like a very large figure in railway projects terms, but when you think of the number of vehicles on the UK rail network, so depending on where you read, there are anywhere between 10 and 30,000 trains in the UK, and if you multiply those with the number of carriages, you start coming up to very, very large numbers can be saved over a 30-year period. The railway is a super long-term asset and a long-term investment, and we need, when delivering programs, delivering projects, we need to think about the whole life cost, not just today's capital cost. And if I want to sell electrification to UK Treasury, we can't only do that through decarbonisation. The Treasury are also really looking at costs, particularly at the moment. So yeah, my last slide. I want to cover the benefits, and we often talk about in the railway passengers first, then we might talk about freight, and then we talk about our neighbours. So I'm going to deliberately again turn it on its head and talk about things the other way round, with our neighbours first, then freight, then passengers. And you can put a bubble around all of this of decarbonisation. But we want decarbonisation, but to enable that, we also need modal shift to rail. So we want to make the railways better to move people out of their cars into railway. So yeah, why do people want to use an electric railway? So yeah, the first one that Helen already mentioned is the environment. So electric railways are quieter. They support improved air quality, and anyone who has stood on the platforms of Birmingham New Street knows air quality issues can be a problem on the railway, and also carbon. So when building projects, you embed carbon in infrastructure just through construction materials. Rail electrification has a really short payback period, 3 to 4 years. So electrifying and then be able to remove diesel trains has a really quick carbon payback period. And that improved environment helps everyone, not just the neighbours. It helps the business case for moving lorries to rail freight. You only have to see the positive PR that supermarkets have had in the past few years, moving food and other consumables by the rail network. And it obviously, again, helps passengers and staff stood on our platforms. Another factor there, longer, faster freight trains. Well, that obviously helps freight, but actually faster freight trains help capacity because you can put more trains on the line, and they also help passengers. You're less likely to delay a passenger train, and it helps neighbours because actually the better the business case for freight, the more lorries we can take off our UK roads. Yeah, electric trains have shorter journey times, and as I've already mentioned, that gives you more seats, and that makes better journeys. and it creates more capacity again for passengers and freight. And then reliability helps that transition to more modal shift. If we know our train's going to turn up on time, or our freight train will deliver goods in time, we're much more likely to use it, and that helps the wider society. Because decarbonisation isn't just about technology, and we always in these webinars focus on technology. It's about getting people out of cars and onto railways and buses and walking and cycling. The CCC, so the Climate Change Committee for the UK, as part of their plans, have said we need to have a 20% modal shift to active and public transport, and the current rail network as it stands now couldn't support that. And really, to enable that, we need electrification. So yeah, that's it for me. Yeah, obviously we're going to take questions, but this was just a preamble to say in the next couple of weeks we will be publishing a report through RIA. So yeah, just keep a lookout for that.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Noel. David, I assume you don't want to make any more opening remarks, or do you want to open with anything else that you're ready?
No, I'm quite happy to go on to the panel discussion and the questions that the audience have got.
And they are coming in, but before we go there, I want to understand who we are speaking to. So I have prepared a little poll that basically want to understand who are you? Who are you? Do you work in railways, roads, aviation, maritime, cross sector, or are you entire different kettle of fish? So before it would be good to understand. David, you're also allowed to vote. You're part of the audience. Okay, wow, 82% of so far we got the railway people. So we are preaching to converted here and people who actually understand. Oh, we got somebody from somewhere completely else. Good. And it's interesting to see that there are cross-sector people here as well. So we have some learnings from other industries. So I expect that to be reflected in the Q&A. Right, I will leave one more second or two. We have about 54 people in the audience and 44 responded. Last chance. I am about to close this, but it's panelist. Please take note. Who are you talking to? Amazing. Okay, thank you very much. So, oh, I think I need to close the poll. There we go. So I have 4 questions so far came in, and I did say I will give you the opportunity to ask it in person, but we have the question written down. So I will call them in the manner of appearance. So Stephen Kent, Stephen Brown. Stephen Brown, you were the first one. So if you would like to come in and ask your question in person.
Yeah, sorry, morning all. And yeah, really enjoyed that that start from the members of the panel that have spoken. I'm one of those that's worked in railways probably for the last 30 years, but just to get the conversation debate going, if I were to bump into the members of the panel in a lift, for example, what would their response be if, I sort of said, well, with the cost of living crisis facing us all, why shouldn't the government focus the limited spend that they perhaps have on the more carbon heavy modes of transport, because you get more, as they say, bang for your buck?
Amazing. Thank you very much, Stephen. So David, I see you're ready to jump into that elevator.
Okay, so as Helen said, it's not really a choice. We've got to decarbonize the whole of the economy, so we can't ignore any one piece of it. Absolutely, the government should focus on the lion's share of transport emissions, which is road, aviation, and etc. And they're doing that. They're putting measures in place to regulate and incentivize us all to move towards electrified road transport, for example. But you can't ignore rail, and nor should you ignore rail. Rail's a key part of the transport mix. It can help decarbonize roads through modal shift, and also thinking of the cost of living crisis. Part of the cost of living crisis is people's wages. And one of the things that we shouldn't forget is that a program of investment in the railways, for every pound you spend on that investment, you generate £2.50 in the wider economy. And as Noel has actually been talking about, never mind carbon, it's actually a cost-effective way to run a railway. So why wouldn't you invest in the railway to make it lower its costs in the long term, make it more attractive to users, and encourage modal shift, so that rail can do more than its fair share of reducing transport emissions.
Thank
Very
you, David.
long elevator.
Yeah, you were going up the Shard, I think, there, or the Burj Khalifa.
I think it was probably Burj Khalifa, but thanks,
Yeah.
David.
Okay,
Yeah.
if
Sorry,
any other panelists have shorter lift journeys, please come in.
Yes, sorry, I did have a couple of points. Whether it would be shorter, not sure. One thing, as everyone was, 3/4 of the people on this panel, in this group are in rail. I've been to lots of automotive conferences for my sins, and they are banging the drum and saying to the government, all your investment should come to us. So for anyone working in rail or public transport or thinking there should be modal shift, if we are not banging the drum, all the money will go to automotive. So yeah, bear that in mind. Secondly, also my sins, I worked on a study looking at electrifying HGVs coming out of Southampton, the port of Southampton, up to the Midlands. And for those who remember, a few years ago, there was a proposal by Network Rail and the DfT to electrify the railway with overhead line coming out of Southampton to take electric freight. It seems to me a bonkers way to spend money to electrify lorries when actually we should be moving those lorries off the road anyway, on a project that has already been proposed and already had a really good business case. And for the wider economy and cost of living crisis, investing in the railways, as David said, really helps UK productivity, and it also provides really good jobs. So RIA have their economics study that I'm sure is available on their website that really demonstrates that.
Okay, thank you, Noel. Just before we go on, we have lots of questions coming in, so please do keep your answers succinct. Helen, do you have anything to add to Stephen's question?
Just economically, we're firefighting at the moment, but funded sustainable plan to decarbonise the railway does not require huge injections of cash now. You know, in addition to the points that the excellent points that both Noel and David have made, you know, we're not standing here going, could you please give £1 billion to the railway over the next 24 months? That's not what it is. It's currently low, then ramping investment in infrastructure that will generate jobs and economic growth and prevent us having to firefight this issue in 15 years' time.
Amazing. Thank you very much. International Women's Day, and this Helen leads the way. So Gavin, it's your chance now. If you feel comfortable, do introduce yourself. We want to understand who we are talking to.
Hi there, yeah. My question was just for David. Just at the end of his bit at the beginning, he said about hydrogenated vegetable oils as an alternative fuel, and I just made a point there about obviously you'd have to grow those crops for the oils in the same area that you're growing either carbon sinks at the moment or food, and as we've got lots of issues with food security at the moment because of the environment issue, would that not it wouldn't be, it doesn't seem like it'd be the best solution compared to electrification. That was the point, basically. Sorry.
Thanks, Gavin.
Nerve-wracking to it.
Thanks, Gavin. No, totally get your point. As with a lot of things, there's different sources of HVO, and in the same way that the oil supply chain isn't sort of the fossil fuel supply chain isn't always perfect, nor is any other supply chain. It's perfect. There are. It's perfectly possible to buy HVO that's entirely generated from waste, so it doesn't require new plant stock to in the way that you describe, which would have the problem you describe. Of course, as we scale up, that becomes a major problem because there isn't enough cooking oil in the world and of course you've got to grow. Cooking oil comes from plants in the first place. You don't want to end up in the situation you're suggesting where we're growing oil we're growing plants for the sake of making oil to just burn it. So that I only see things personally. I'm not an expert in this field. I only see these things as a potential interim solution. So while we've got supplies of waste HVO, I think that's fine. And why wouldn't we seek to reduce carbon emissions now? One of the problems, as I alluded to, is actually HVO costs more than diesel. But isn't it actually a better, if we could get a more sustainable, as in available, supply chain, then those costs would come down, but they're not, because we've got this chicken and egg situation. But you're quite right to check. We always have to look at any solution as to whether it's environmentally sustainable, and you're quite right.
And very topical. I don't know, Helen, did you want to add something? Just your screen flashed up for a second there.
Oh, so it was just the agreement that biofuels, I think, are largely an interim solution. So yes, it's a land use issue. It depends on the pace of the final solutions that can be put in place. If we can get kind of electrification, hydrogen and battery in place quicker, then biofuels are required less. If we're extending the programme out for decades past 2050, then biofuels would be needed longer in order to have a low carbon solution. And I agree, it's less than ideal, but it feels better than the alternative.
Well, Andrew Gainsbury has a question that actually fits within this discussion very well. Andrew, if you're here and ready to ask a question in person, please do so.
Yeah, definitely. I think, to be honest, it's largely been answered. Just to give some background, work at Transport for Wales, and we're trying to put together our decarbonisation strategy, and certainly personally I'm a big advocate of electrification and trying to sort of bang that drum, but it's going to be a very long way off before we get our network electrified. Even if, as I say to people, we had all the money in the world now, it's still going to take some time. So we are going to be looking at interims, and I think with a large diesel fleet, that's going to include things like alternative fuels. So I mean, I think people have already answered that, and part of it for me is knowing the setbacks of that, because some people see it as a long-term solution. I've been saying, well, no, I don't think it is really for all sorts of reasons. So it's good to have that reinforcement that we still need to be seeking electrification as a long-term solution. But I'd certainly welcome any thoughts anybody has on sort of the direction that's going. I mean, HVO seems to be the one that DB are using at scale, and from reading up, seems to have a lot of the benefits. But any other thoughts would certainly be appreciated. As say, we're probably looking at that as an interim.
Any thoughts, panel?
I not particularly on HVO, but on phasing out diesel and alternatives. Certainly we've looked at lots of projects where, say, battery charging has been an interim solution to long-term electrification. There's a live project currently in Ireland for their new fleet, where they know they won't electrify a route in time for their new trains, so they're building battery charge stations that are modular. so when they have electrified a line, they can then move those battery charge stations on to the next location, and batteries also work slightly well in hybrid solutions where perhaps you have a train that runs on a branch line which has a very infrequent service where you would struggle to justify full electrification. But if the main line's electrified, actually you would want to draw power to that, although it obviously becomes complex with drawing lots and lots of power from the overhead line. So yeah, I think there are lots of hybrid and interim solutions, and yeah, it's all part of developing a long-term plan.
I think a key bit of the jigsaw which is missing at the moment is clarity about which bits of the network are going to be electrified and when. The only place we've got that clarity, or to a significant degree, is in Scotland, where they've literally drawn a map and said this is where we're going to electrify. And what that does is it gives confidence to those who might be coming up with the alternative solutions, because they know the environment which they're working in. They know the places that are never going to be electrified, and that's one set of solutions. And they know the places that will be electrified eventually, but maybe not for quite a while. And therefore they can look at interim solutions. And I think if we could get across the UK clarity on the places that are going to be electrified, then the business case for both interim and permanent solutions that aren't electrification would come to the fore. But in the absence of that basic clarity, then it means there's lots of technical solutions floating about, all in search of a business case.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephen Kent, it is your turn now. And Stephen comes at us with some data from RSSB. So Stephen, please share your thinking.
Hi, so yeah, Stephen Kent. I work as a researcher at the University of Birmingham. I've been around in the rail industry for many years. I've done quite a lot of work on both hydrogen and decarbonisation of various sorts. There's a piece of work they published recently called T1237, if you go on the Spark database. I think it's a good piece of work. That's partly because I was involved in writing it. But I wondered, are the panel even aware of that piece of work? Because it's got some very, very useful numbers and almost like a hierarchy that's justified with those numbers as to what you might do going forwards. So question, have you heard of it? Have you read it?
I'm aware of it. I can't pretend I've read it from cover to cover, but I have had a look at it, and I picked up some of the stats out of it. I have used some data from it, and the one you put in the chat about an electric train in operation for 30 years uses 1/12 of the diesel. That it's those sort of facts that really help people that are building business cases. So thanks for I think we should all be referencing it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. I see your hand, Julian. I will made a note. I'll come to you in a second. Now we're off to Drew Stewart and his question about embodied carbon and better data about it, which is something we haven't really covered yet. So it's interesting to hear your thoughts about that. Drew?
Hi. Yeah, I work as a consultant in construction and engineering. I've worked on quite a few different kind of rail infrastructure projects, but at the moment we're working with a rail lessor company, it sort of trying to plan a climate strategy for them. So really the question I had was, how as a rail lessor company can they, best position themselves to engage with their supply chain? So the upstream manufacturers of locomotives and the downstream rail operators to really influence their supply chain in terms of low carbon design, technology, and to obtain better emissions data.
Thank you, Drew. Who wants to come to that?
Do you want me to pick up just to start? I mean, I think that's an absolutely great question, and certainly in RIA we're moving to pay more attention, much more focus on embedded or embodied carbon, whichever term you prefer. I think it's really good to hear that clients are setting targets on, in the jargon, the scope 2 and 3 emissions that they're responsible for. So in translating it, if a rail lessor says, I want to be net zero by 2050, then they need to work and engage with all of their partners to understand each partner's contribution to that, and what the opportunities are through, whatever technology or approach to drive that down. And there's some really good thinking I've certainly seen going on in the infrastructure industry, where infrastructure part of rail, that show that kind of collaborative work going on and the nudge factor is that the client, in this case the rail lessor, can effectively say, well, I'm not buying your product unless it's on my trajectory, which, if they weren't already, would encourage the businesses to respond. It's worth saying that most people who build trains are big enough companies to have major ESG reporting requirements of their own, and are likely to have their own very strong net zero program. So you're likely to be pushing at an open door, is my suggestion.
Just to
any
chip
other?
in,
Yep.
yeah. So just chip in again to add on to David's points about infrastructure, and I would hope trains and fleet would mirror this. In lots of the recent tenders I've seen, and a really good example is HS2s, is a substantial part of the tenders are now carbon reduction. So if you can show with your design in infrastructure you are saving X tons of concrete, you can put a real value to that. So there is an economic value and an imperative to reduce carbon in what you're proposing. And I definitely think rolling stock probably is doing the same, and definitely needs to. We've seen as well across Europe, lots of tenders have things like how much of your equipment is moved by rail freight rather than roads, as another key tender requirement. If you put pressure on suppliers and that becomes financial, definitely decarbonize quicker. And on that as well, yeah, all companies, if they work in this sector, really should have their own plans for how they will reach net zero by 2050 as well.
Helen, do you have any comments on this?
So I agree with all of that, but I think that if companies are going to do that, they have to mean it, and it's not just something that they ask about, but then actually go with the cheapest bid. In the end, they have to mean it, and it has to have teeth, otherwise it loses its value in tenders. I think that's all I would add.
Excellent. David Dundas, you have some debates going on in the chat and your own questions, so it's your time to shine now. And you are muted. You need to just click on the microphone icon. I cannot unmute you. I can only mute you, but I cannot unmute. Excellent. Yes, we can. Amazing.
So 40% of our rail network is not what is run by diesel DMUs. The cost of electrification is huge, as I think we all recognise. One of the reasons why many of these lines have not been electrified is that they still have 19th century low bridges and have to be rebuilt in order to pass the overhead catenaries. And the other reason is there isn't enough traffic on those lines to justify the cost of electrification. Also, as you probably realise, the overhead catenaries are liable to extreme weather events, and they can cause them to sag, to flying objects, falling trees, and so on. So they're not ideal in that respect. But I would accept that from an energy efficiency point of view, electrification, connecting the trains directly to the generator, is the most energy efficient. But having said that, in the meantime, because of the cost of electrification is so high and we only have 17 years to get to 2040, would it not be better to have a program of converting the existing DMUs to hydrogen or perhaps electric battery only in some circumstances, rather than just simply saying we can only decarbonize with electrification? Thank you for listening.
So I'm happy to jump in there if that's okay. There's some really good points in there. There are having overhead wires up is difficult. You will need whole new maintenance regimes and plans for during disruption and things like that to be put in place. We could have a whole one of these sessions if we got some electrification engineers on about overhead versus DC third rail, but I don't want to derail this altogether. I think electrification is expensive. Everything in the railway is expensive. That doesn't mean it's not good value. We do need to keep trying to do it more effectively and efficiently. And one of the big things that we need to do with the current suite of electrification projects that are out there is deliver to budget and to programme. Nothing will scupper a programme of electrification quicker than the next big electrification project going over budget. I think we can make electrification projects cheaper, more affordable, even better value by ruthlessly implementing innovative technology. And I don't mean things that haven't been invented yet. I mean things like squeezing clearances on structures and insulating paint, and there's a big long list of things that can be put in place that reduce the level of civils works that's required. That is the primary driver in the electrification cost, and we need to be doing that, and part of that is designing to the output required and having a sensible conversation with the regulator and with RSSB and with people who write the standards about what is safe and what is deliverable. So kind of that whole affordability thing is wires is a big topic in itself. The whole affordability thing is a big topic in itself, and I think we can do it better. In terms of it's expensive and it will take a long time, should we not be doing other stuff in the meantime? Well, absolutely, yes. We need to be doing all the things in the meantime. We need interim solutions in order to get us there. It will be electrified eventually, therefore we'll just wait. Absolutely, we need to be doing things in the meantime and using other technologies that aren't electrification to deliver carbon savings.
I just wanted to add a couple of things to Helen's great points. One on climate adaptation. So yeah, as our climate changes, the whole railway and electrification is just one part of that, needs to adapt, and a lot of work is going on in that sector already, as well as lowering the cost of electrification. So some of the technology Helen mentioned obviously is being developed and is being deployed in real life projects now. Generally with electrification, it is substantially more reliable than any alternative traction power. So on the route, I live on a branch line off Great Western. When it was electrified, performance did actually improve by 300%. That was the 300% I mentioned in my slides. It was 300% more reliable than the diesel trains that came before it, and having complex hydrogen supply chains in lots of the country, that is an issue in itself. Definitely hydrogen and battery are great interim solutions, and on some routes will be needed as a permanent solution. There will absolutely be routes that we will never justify the capital cost of electrification, and they will need hydrogen and they will need batteries. So that they are definitely coming. And go back to David's original presentation where he said, yeah, we need those projects now and not in 20 years.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Julian Worth, it is you. Thank you for your patience. You have been waiting a long time to make your comments.
Thank you, Milda. No problem at all. Firstly, a very quick point about embedded carbon. One of the things we often forget is that railway vehicles often last 30 or 40 years. Road vehicles last about 7 or 8 in frontline service and perhaps a few more in second order service. So we are much, much better than road in terms of embedded carbon and everything that goes with vehicle life and those sorts of things. However, that's not why I put my hand up. I put my hand up to make 2 points of hopefully some significance. The firstly is that modal shift is hugely underrated in terms of why this all matters. The work we've done in CILT suggests that about 30% of all HGV ton kilometres, that's not just trunk kilometres, all HGV ton kilometres are broadly suitable for modal switch to rail. And that's made up of the long distance stuff over about 300 kilometres where battery HGVs probably ain't going to get there in the foreseeable future. But also there's some of the shorter hauls of aggregates and other bulk materials. So it is absolutely realistic to claim the benefits of modal shift, which are substantial in support of electrification of rail. We need to bridge these modal silos more. Thinking in modal silos is never going to get us to the right place. Secondly, and I've put the link to the CILT paper in the chat, although I guess quite a lot of people in this call have already seen it. We are, as we've already reflected in this call, a coalition of the converted. We are not the problem. DfT isn't the problem. The problem is the Treasury. Frankly, it's an exaggeration to say they don't care about decarbonisation, because they do really, but they are much more motivated by what's the actual cost and what is the economic payback, the direct economic payback of doing all this stuff. Sad to say, after Great Western electrification, the mainstream electrification really hasn't got a lot better, and the costs I'm seeing emerging from MML and projected for TransPennine are right up there with Great Western standards. They're not coming down. So that's why we launched the initiative with CILT and some people on this call, by the way, to try and get electrification costs down, at least for freight. And there are really credible grounds for believing that we can get the cost down to something like half the costs that are currently running at the minute. A number of reasons for that, partly lower speed, but not entirely lower speed. It's something to do with delivery systems as well, of making delivery systems much simpler and slicker. But you know, we've got to get there, because unless we present Treasury with something that is digestible and affordable, we ain't going to get it. It's as simple as that. And that's why we've broken the freight electrification proposal down into small digestible chunks. 40 miles a year at about £100 million a year, which is broadly one smallish road scheme a year, would get us by 2046, 47, something like that, to a 95% coverage of freight being electrified. It's much easier to get approval from Treasury to say we want a little bit at a time as part of a slow progress towards an end objective, rather than is to say we want 13,000 single track kilometres now, please. TDNS was a great programme. Helen and Stephen and the team did a fantastic job in that. Unfortunately, the way it was interpreted by Treasury was that we've got to sign up to all this now. That's what spooked them. So we've got to make it cheaper and we've got to make it digestible if we're going to make this work. I happen to think we can, folks. So, you know, no desperandum. I'm sure we can do this, but we've got to sort of change our tactics, and we've got to demonstrate that it makes pure financial sense, and the decarbonisation, the social benefits will be a bonus, but they don't come, sadly. Thank you, Milda.
Yeah, no, thank you, Julian. You got applause from David, and I think there are some other hands are being raised. So we're in the last sort of 20 minutes of the meeting, and I have some more questions coming in. Does any of the panelists want to have a quick comment to what Julian was saying?
So I agree. I think what would be great for freight would be a good solid long-term growth target from government, and that would also incentivize modal shift from road to rail, which in itself is kind of a lower carbon option. And then the level of investment that's outlined in the CILT report in order to get that electrification for freight is 100 million a year, is higher than has been invested in freight so far over the past decade per year, but it's not completely out there. So it feels like a much more achievable ask. It's like it's this, and it might come, especially if we can do things around the gauging and squeeze the distances, not have to do all the civils that might be required, should be achievable. But that program combined with a growth target would be a huge goal, a huge step in the right direction for rail freight.
Thank you, Helen. Okay, we have more questions coming in than we have time to cover them all, so I'll try and get through them. So John sorry, is it John Skinner? I've scribbled it down, but then now I can't recognize my own writing. You had a quick question. Do you want to come in? It is Skinner. There you go. It's something that David said about technical solutions in need of a business case that should be our focus, John.
Yes, hello. I'm looking at options to kind of take this agenda forward, and it was David's words that really rang true there. You've got some real expertise on this call and in the industry, and I think it would be most appealing if with David's help and RIA's help, we were able to take these initiatives and imperatives forward. That was the gist of my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Tom Barry, you had an interesting take on this discussion about our networks with Network Rail. Isn't it the biggest electric supply consumer? And you suggested that maybe it should generate its own energy to be independent. Tom, are you still on the call? Are you able to?
Yes, I'm still here, Milder. I've got COVID at the moment. I'm not very attractive, so I'll keep my camera off.
Oh,
You look, yesterday I was in bed taking calls, but today I'm actually sitting at my desk. It's just with the energy price volatility due to things happening in Europe, just more remote parts of the UK might be ideal for creating sort of a renewable railway only power supply, possibly selling it to others. There's an opportunity there, whether it be for battery storage or direct feeding off a wind farm or whatever, or a solar. Just the other side of the fence, if you like, not just looking at the trains, looking at where the power comes from as well. I just wonder whether the panel had thought about that. And my first point in the question was really agreeing with what's gone before, is it's all about affordability. And if we slash it in half, the Treasury will want it slashed in half again. If we do that, they'll want it slashed in half. It's never going to be cheap enough for the Treasury. The business case could have a 10 return on investment, and they'll still want more. There's got to be a grown up in the room at some point. Anyway, back to the views on renewable power supplies for the railway.
Do you want me to pick that up, Milder?
Sure.
The good news is, and I don't know all the details, but the good news is Network Rail are quite actively looking at this. They're looking at direct wire renewables. So what that means is they would own or partner with somebody who owns a renewable source of generation, and they connect it directly to the railway, perhaps with some battery storage in the equation. That's been very actively looked at, and it's particularly been looked at in areas where it would be reinforcing the existing power supply, because what some on the call will be aware of is that for all sorts of reasons, then the existing railway power supply is often not man enough, as it were, for the services that we might want to run. And therefore, line-side energy storage and direct wire renewables and things like that could save not only the good from energy security point of view, but they could save the cost of a major investment in upgrading the grid connection, for instance. So there, I'm pleased to say that is being actively looked at.
And
just to add in there, sorry, yeah, I've also worked on projects across Europe where we've used renewables such as solar panels on station roofs to support providing decarbonised power. And I know in the new Welsh test track at GCRE, just north of Swansea, they are looking at how they can power their site from all the wind power that's around the location there in the at their test track.
Thank you, Noel. I see, Patrick, you have your hand up, but
No, sorry,
there are
just
some
thought I'd-
people. I wonder if you could make your comment very quickly,
I'll
or
be
maybe.
very quick.
Okay.
So I work in network rail, corporate finance and business development, and indeed we are looking at renewable energy, but the difference is that we're looking to work with the private sector. So we won't own these facilities. These are guys who do this for a living. Let them do that. We'll run the trains. So we signed a deal with EDFR, a project I led last July for the first solar plant via corporate PPA. We're in the market for another corporate PPA. That one was 65 gigawatt hours. This one I'm doing now would be a terawatt hour. And we're looking at direct wire, and we're looking at some beanie schemes in Scotland to put solar PV on any roof space that will take it. So that's my 30-second pitch on what we're doing in this space.
Well, am I glad to have allowed this this pitch? Nice to see you, Patrick, and thank you for joining this. And I sense that an invitation will be coming your way from RIA to come and talk about the work you're doing to a bit more than 30 seconds. So if you don't mind, maybe dropping us an email, and I'll pop my email into the chat. It would be great to connect with you.
Okay.
So Simon Cresswell, you had a potentially sort of a good follow-up question to the discussion about resilience and through the power outages and sort of having the reliability conversation that we had earlier. So Simon Cresswell, are you still there? There he is. The floor is yours, but we cannot hear you for some reason. Your headphones might be not connected.
Hear me now?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yep.
Oh,
Sorry.
it was the whole
Yes.
the whole trick.
Apologies.
Okay, got it.
Apologies. Yeah, it's a question regarding electrification. If it's wholesale across the network, which I don't think it's going to be, then then you lose the traction power in mobile units. So when power goes out, then you can't run any trains. Whereas if you've got traction power on a rolling stock, then you can still run those trains. And I wondered how that was being considered as part of the equation.
It's certainly a consideration, Simon. But if you look at other countries, Switzerland is the classic example where 100% of their network is electrified. The challenge is designing, maintaining, so that is a very rare occurrence, and when it does occur, you're swift at recovering. So if you have a contingency for everything that could possibly go wrong, you run a very expensive system. Whereas if you actually just focus on making the system work and work well, we tend to be great firefighters in the UK. We tend to want, to have a backup for the backup. That's one school of thought, but I'd rather make it work in the first place.
Yeah, it's obviously got to work in the first place and be efficient. Just to consider things like world tension and resilience of the railway. If you're stuck with power across the network and have no flexibility, then it's a big problem.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks.
There is an inspiring message in the chat from Pat Clipperton about not beating ourselves up too much. So thank you, Pat. I don't know if you want to come in. We have only 9 minutes left, but I think we could hear from you for longer. But if you want to come in and just say something.
Thanks, Milda. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It's right. The contribution of carbon is very, very low on the rail. I think the modal shift equation has to be pushed very hard to transfer anything from the road onto the railway. This will bring about a pressure on the cost of using the railway for passengers and freight. This will make it more popular, I hope, and may bring the attention to the Treasury and so on, that something much more serious needs to be done to support the railway. I think the technology of electricity, battery, hydrogen will come. It'll come in various phases. Like ERTMS, it will come only where it's actually going to be very, very suitable and supportive. So I really don't like to see people beating themselves up. There will be stuff coming through. I'm afraid the dates will be very, very challenging for everybody because, like everything else, everybody is suffering from a shortage of cash. Simple as that. And it's affordability. And we've got to be sensible about what we can do and what we can't do. That's it.
Thank you, Patrick. Always good to see you and hear from you. And I see.
Sorry, just to chip in there.
Oh yeah.
Oh, sorry, just to chip in. Sorry, Milda. I completely agree. We only ever focus on, or we often focus on, just the technical solutions. But yeah, as Patrick said, ticketing reform is at least, if not more important, if we want modal shift and decarbonisation and to get more people onto the railways.
That's putting the customer first in all of our thinking, and not forgetting we're not running the railway just for the sake of it, because it's fun to do. David Shearer, yes.
Just very quickly, that the transport decarbonisation plan from the government in 2020 that I referenced, I'd encourage you to, I'll put a link in the chat. It's a very good document. If we could just, if the Treasury could help us get behind it, then we'd be in a much better place. It's saying all the right things.
I don't know if we have any. Yes.
If you're reading that, read the rail policy statement that goes with it, which goes into even more detail. But yeah, I agree, they're both very good documents.
Talking about the Treasury, we will finish this conversation about business cases, and that's what they like to hear, right? And David Shearer, please, it's your time to shine.
Oh, thanks, Milda, and thanks everybody for the presentations and questions. I like to think I'm reasonably au fait with this particular topic, but you always learn something at these events. One specific question that's related to actually making the case for electrification is the way that carbon can get valued in business cases. I know that the DFT actually do put certain values on carbon saved, but I don't know the practicalities of how you can actually incorporate that in a business case, and I'd welcome some clarification on that.
So it's in TAG, the cost of carbon saved. So it goes into the benefits of the business case for the electrification scheme. It tends to be dwarfed for rail by other benefits that go along with it. If you're making a freight case, then the lack of congestion that moving freight onto rail, the benefits that brings are much greater than the carbon benefits associated with it. So until the last couple of years, the value of carbon was quite low in business cases. It's been increased by the government. I think it will be increased a lot more over the next decade or so as the issue of climate change rises at people's lists. So while it does contribute to the business case for an electrification or hydrogen or battery project, it doesn't often tip the scales. And what it most definitely doesn't do is give you it's not the differentiator between should you invest in road, should you invest in rail. So I think, yes, we should have the carbon value in there. Yes, it should be right, and by right I mean higher. But I don't think it's the thing to rely on when looking at allocation of funding to invest in this.
Okay, thanks, Alan.
Any more comments? There were some conversations going on in the chat around this, so if you have access, do have a look. Gavin has made a last sort of a point that he forgot to mention about light rail and whether decarbonizing city centers and reducing pollution in this could be one way of doing it. And so with your closing remarks, if you can also think about light rail, and I will just go around the panel to close it. So Helen, would you like to start? Considering it's International Women's Day, I give you a preferential treatment.
Thank you. Every day is International Women's Day in this house. But in terms of light rail in city centres, it's a big investment, and I think we need to look carefully at what the right answer is in any given city centre. It's not an area that I'm particularly up on, so I don't really want to opine any more than that.
No, I was just sort of thinking about sort of the Dutch or I mean the French even are probably better at it than we are. We don't have a lot of cities where your main way of getting to your railhead is anything other than either walking if you live in close proximity, or buses or cars, which are, you know, your embodied carbon for your whole journey is bigger, isn't it?
So better public transport and better mobile forms of transport. Absolutely, I am all. And joined up transport, that's a whole other webinar. So yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Whether light rail is the answer, I'm less sure. In general, overall, decarbonising rail, you know, we should. We're going to need to. If we start now, there is more benefit than if we start later. We need to deliver on time, on budget, and we can. I think I've said most of the things that I wanted to say. Modal shift is absolutely critical in order to do this. I think possibly the only thing I haven't said is to agree with Julian that it's not a conversation with the DfT, it's a conversation with the Treasury, and it's a conversation with other departments of government where the benefits of doing a programme of electrification and decarbonising the railway would be seen. So it's a conversation with BEIS, and it's a conversation about levelling up. And it will, once we've got a kind of government plan to hit net zero by 2050, it'll be a conversation with whoever's in charge of that.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Noel, you have less than 1 minute to summarize your thoughts.
I will be really quick then. One on light rail. I do think there is a case for a lot of light rail. There's a few cities that stand out to me. Leeds being the biggest, where how it's not got a tram, I find unbelievable. We do need end-to-end journeys, so it's not just about rail. People need to be able to get to a train station and to their work, etc. I've got 2 plugs. One, lots of people said, well, how can I get involved? If you're a RIA member, there is the Decarbonisation Technical Interest Group, so yeah, do turn up or dial in. And for those interested in electrification costs, the PWI are having a conference in April specifically looking at how can we reduce costs and make electrification more affordable. So yeah, do have a look out for that.
Thank you. I don't know, David, if you allow me this, but I would like to summarize. And which also with a plug, at the 23rd of May, we are hosting our now 2nd time Traction Power Innovation and Safety Showcase, delivered together with Network Rail team. There's an opportunity to exhibit if you're a supplier, or opportunity to join the event and learn from innovations in safety and electrification if you're decarbonisation curious. So I've posted a link to the chat. Please have a look, and if you would like to exhibit, the expression of interest is open. And I will give you, David, the last word.
Oh, thank you. I mean, my point is we need to get on with it, because we need to get on with decarbonising the railway. It's the right thing to do for future generations. And if we wait too long, it will cost more. We have to do it anyway. It's the law. It's the right thing to do. We just need to get on with it. And to do that, it'd be really helpful to have a plan for the core amount of electrification, and then we can do clever things around the edges of that. So please, can we just get on with it?
And with those words, I would like to thank everyone who joined today. It was absolute pleasure. I didn't need to use any of my pre-prepared questions, so you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you for supporting this initiative and this webinar, and I hope we'll see you soon again.
Thank you, Milda.
Thanks, Milda.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, Milda.
Thank you.